Well, ladies and gentlemen, some very interesting news articles today. But before we get on to the main news story of today, can you yet again remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and, you know what, share this video with some friends. Bring more friends to the channel and help the channel grow. And I guess let's get on to the first news story of today. And the first one's a doozy, and it's really the hidden genocide in Sudan, who the ANC have, well, they've not said a thing. Obviously, they only really say things about donors and funders, but when it comes through to actual genocide occurring on the soils of Africa, the ANC is silent. Now, horrific new evidence from Sudan shows that it's one of the country's worst ethnic massacres ever. Civilians are fleeing the cities, and they're being executed by the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF and Arab militia targeting black African groups. So it would appear when Arabs are killing black Africans, well, that's okay. Black child is no longer on their own because no one's going to say a thing. In any case, survivors describe being shot, run over, beaten, and ransomed. They've been ransomed for over 10 million Sudanese pounds, which is roughly equating to around £2,000. Only 4 of 200 people in one group that attempted to run away actually survived. And the way they did that was they paid the survival fee in order to avoid their death. Now, Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab estimates that more people have died in Sudan just in the last week than have died in the entire Gaza war. So obviously what they'll attempt to do now is create an ICJ case, said no one ever. Now they've called it a velocity of killings comparable to Rwanda 1994. And obviously the UN is stepping in to avoid the massacre. Of course they're not, because the UN only cares when there's one specific tiny little nation in Arab states. Now, satellite imagery confirms mass graves, hospital attacks, and RSF checkpoints. No foreign journalists had been allowed in the area for 2 years, and I'm reminded that when it came through to Gaza, they moaned like hell that journalists weren't allowed in because it was an active war zone. But nobody says a thing about Sudan. I mean, who cares about Sudan? Now, the story underscores total impunity, silence from global powers, and the humanitarian collapse across Sudan. And nobody cares. Now, I'd like to say that this was the only massacre being occurred by crazy Islamists in the African continent, but I would draw your reference to Nigeria. And I did that in a video yesterday, and if you want more information on that, go watch that video. In other news, the USA Refugee Programme, well, that's been updated by the United States Embassy with regards to its refugee admissions program after the executive order given by President Donald Trump. Now, the order, as you know, allows Afrikaners and racial minorities who are claiming government-sponsored race-based discrimination to apply for resettlement in the US. Now, I did say at the time that people would have to prove things, and I was told, well, there were other people on YouTube that told them that they wouldn't, and that some other bull rubbish, they could just put their paperwork in there and some rubbish. I did say as a lawyer, that's just generally not how these things work, and all the ChatGPT lawyers told me I was wrong. Well, in accordance with the updated admissions program information on the US Embassy website, applicants must prove persecution based on race, religion, nationality, or political opinion, and must currently reside in South Africa. Now, the South African government has slammed the entire thing as apartheid 2.0 because it's like racial segregation politics, they say, with white people trying to live separately from black people. White people wouldn't think anything of the program if the ANC didn't have as many race-based legislation or principles or policies as they do, with all the constant jabbering on about how they really just want people to pay for what the sins of their fathers were. In any case, the program won't process applications abroad, so refugees must apply while still in South Africa, and that's typically how refugee status works. As you know, the whole move deepens diplomatic friction and feeds into broader debates about race, minority rights, and the US foreign policy realignment under Trump. And this obviously is after the news came out that Trump was only going to take like 7,500 refugees from South Africa. So he's going to be rather selective about who they take. Okay, so looking at the US, you may have noticed that the US has now got a new mayor in New York City. And it's the first major election since Donald Trump's return. Now, as you know, Democrats swept New York City, Virginia, and New Jersey, with Madani, the 34-year-old Democratic socialist, becoming the New York City mayor. And this has signaled a generational shift because it's actually a young person being voted into a leadership position for once. So you may say, well, what's New York got to do with us? Well, apparently this guy got educated in Cape Town, and then he went to the US. So some of his loony ideas are more South African. So he is going to South Africanify New York City. Isn't that great? Now, many analysts see these three wins as being a grassroots counter-response to Trump's 9-month presidency and a trial run for the 2026 congressional race. Now, the party's dual strategy, which is progressivism urban centers and moderates in swing states, appears to be regaining voter trust. So the Democrats seem that they may get some semblance of power back in 2026, which when it comes into the previous news item around the Refugee Programme, well, one has to ask whether it's still going to be there, or whether there will be bigger problems to fry next year. In any case, let's look at the problems in South Africa, because in South Africa, one of our last ferrochrome plants are warning of possible closures due to unsustainable electricity costs. It's important to recognize that we already had a closure in the steel industry, and that was in the guise of ArcelorMittal, who closed because of electricity costs. Now, the firm says that government promises of electricity tariff relief have never materialized, and I'm shocked to hear that a government promise was never realized. Now, energy now dominates operating costs, so there are several smelters around the country that are closing, with exports restricted and illegal chrome mining surging. So whilst they can't do anything here anymore, it's not that the industries just fade, well, they all go to the criminal underworld, which marks South Africa's shift to become a gangster state and an acceleration of that. We've already seen it in numerous industries, like the mining industry as a whole. Now, if this ferrochrome plant closes, it's one of the world leaders in ferrochrome production, and South Africa would lose a key pillar of its mining economy. It would, as you know, would cost thousands of jobs. But it does symbolize how energy policy failure and state inaction are hollowing out industrial capability in South Africa. But you know where there is no inaction in the state itself? Well, that would be in the case of BEE and all the transformation that goes on. You know, the transformation that allows the ANC to self-enrich. Because in other news, the Trade Minister, Parks, has unveiled a revised 100 billion rand transformation fund to reignite BEE participation. Now, this comes after the last suggestion of a transformation fund, which is basically going to be an additional tax on turnover on businesses. Well, that didn't go down very well, so they've now renewed the transformation fund to make it look nicer. Now, this new version promises clear accountability, governance controls, and voluntary incentives for companies contributing capital. I love the idea that the ANC seems to suggest that whenever they have governance controls and accountability, like we're somehow going to believe them. I recall Cyril saying that none of the money underneath COVID would ever be stolen and that there would be tight controls on it, and there never were. Now, firms will apparently earn BEE scorecard points by investing in the fund for enterprise and supplier development. Now, critics are questioning whether it can actually attract the 100 billion target in 5 years that they were suggesting, and many of them still continue to worry about corruption and poor results in any of the funding that has gone to many of the programs around black entrepreneurials. Because, as we know, in many instances the funds go into various entities, but never actually come out with anything promising. Now, unfortunately, the project shows government's attempt to rehabilitate the whole empowerment policy credibility, but we've seen the entire program just go to waste year after year after year. And so I have to say that everybody will look at the entire fund as exactly what it will be, another fund to loot by the elite. Now, the elite have sat there and thought to themselves, well, equality continues to rise in South Africa. And you see, they try to arrest it by programs such as BE and expropriation, and they only ever self-enrich. But according to a G20 panel led by a Nobel Prize winner that's been commissioned underneath the South African presidency, well, they've declared an inequality emergency. Now, you should find that rather alarming because remember, we had a health emergency and then we had a climate emergency. And according to this individuals, the richest 1% have captured 41% of new wealth between 2020 and 2024, while the bottom half got a whole 1%. Now, the panel has actually warned that inequality now undermines democracy globally and fuels populism and unrests. So, it's kind of true. As people get poorer and as the richer get richer, people are starting to look at it and be like, it's not very good. So what are they recommending? Well, they're recommending to create an international panel on inequality modeled on everything they've just been talking about to track and advise governments. Yes. So what the South African government wants to do is to bring transformation and make it global. Wow. What a lovely, wonderful thing to make global. And they wonder why Trump just said, I don't really want to go to the G20 this year. Now, the World Inequality Lab has praised Ramaphosa for putting the issue on the G20 agenda and framing inequality as a policy choice and not inevitability. And so what we can take from this is that, yes, the World Inequality Lab wants to adopt communism, and they want everybody to be equally poor, as does Ramaphosa, because Ramaphosa is a communist. And yes, they're all so happy to bring transformation onto the world agenda. Aren't you proud, ladies and gentlemen? Isn't it lovely to know that every other country will soon experience, like New York, the South Africanization of their local economies? I can't wait. Now, when it comes to the South African economy, economist Dawie Roots says that South African taxpayers get a whole 5 cents for every 1 rand paid to SARS. So yes, for every 1 rand we pay to SARS, we get a whole 5 cents worth of value. Wow, wonderful. Only 1.5% of citizens actually pay 60.9% of personal tax, and 0.4% pay a third of it. A lot of personal tax is all being paid for a very small amount of people. Now, high income earners, as you know, are immigrating. Around 108,000 left between 2020 and 2024, and this has drained both skills and revenue. Because when a lot of your personal tax relies on high income earners, and then they leave, you don't have a replacement high income earners, well, where are you going to get the tax from? And South Africa has that problem right now, all thanks to their own making. Dawie Roots warns that for every one individual who leaves, one rich individual that is, the state effectively loses funding for 20 poor families, revealing just how fragile the system is because it is reliant on a very small amount of people to pay the majority of the tax. And the entire thing will, as times go by, show just how bad the situation in South Africa may get. With a shrinking tax base and an expanding welfare state, this is a recipe for fiscal collapse because at some point in time, you're just not going to have the money to pay for all the welfare junk. So what the South African economy actually needs to do is get more high net worth individuals. Now, how they're going to do that without ditching BE and all the other stupid things that make people want to leave? Hey, let me know what you think in the comment section below. I'd love to hear. But one way we could do everything is we could just vote the ANC out of power. But God, I really hope we do that. Now, according to the IEC, 104 political parties will now contest the 2026 municipal elections, and this is up from 325 in 2021. Now, over 305,000 new voters have registered in 2025. 76% are using the voter management devices, so they're basically getting in online. Now, the poll budget is around 2.1 billion, so that's what the IEC. So that's what the IEC is going to spend on the elections, with calls for extra funding amid shortfalls, because as you know, money is never enough in South Africa. Somebody's pockets need to be greased. Now, officials hope that tech upgrades because that's how a lot of young people are now getting into the voting arena, or prevent previous glitches, because, paper voting just isn't very good. The counting process alone is incredibly slow, but fragmentation and funding crises remain major risks, and that's because we have no money. So we can't do first world things on third world budgets. Now, the ever-growing list of micro-parties highlights a voter disillusionment and hyper-pluralism in South African politics, because you see, everybody's looking for that home, but nobody really knows where it's going to be, and so everybody tries to offer you one, but to be honest, all it's really doing is fracturing the vote. And so what we can say for now, and I'm sure you want to hear this, is that the ANC probably won't win, but it will most certainly be an election of coalition parties. And I must say, if you've seen anything about coalitions in South Africa, they're typically not very stable, so you can make of that what you wish. And in case that's the news of today, let me know what you think of all this bull rubbish in the comment section below, and until next time, bye.